Apologies, I just realized that I was muted. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this webinar that the GEM Foundation has organized for the release of GEM's Global Earthquake Hazard and Risk Products version 2023. So my name is Helen Crowley. I am the Secretary General of GEM, and I'm just going to spend a few minutes to welcome you to this event and tell you a little bit more about the GEM Foundation before we get into the details of the products that we're releasing today. So the GEM Foundation is a non-profit scientific NGO. It was founded in 2009, and we are governed through a global public-private partnership. Our mission is to develop open software tools and data sets and to release these resources and information at the global scale for global seismic hazard and risk assessment. But we don't just work at the global scale, we also work at regional, national and local level to make sure that these resources and information is used for local applications of disaster risk reduction. And we've chosen today is the UNDRR's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And we've chosen this day to mark the milestone of the release of these products. The theme of today's International Day for DRR is fighting inequality for a resilient future. And this theme resonates very much with GEM, where our vision is for a world that is resilient to earthquakes and other natural hazards. So with the release of these global flagship products, we believe that we are helping to provide insights into the variation of seismic hazard and risk around the world. This insights, this information, these resources provide a number of stakeholders, from risk modelers to insurers to community planners, with the information that's needed to help improve the safety of buildings, to use the land better, to enhance mechanisms for earthquake preparedness and response, and to also increase and incentivize risk transfer mechanisms. And that includes insurance and reinsurance. And all of these actions will help to reduce the disparities in disaster vulnerability. And these are the disparities which are exacerbating inequality around the world. Before we go any further today, I would just like to spend a few minutes to thank all of our sponsors, as well as the major contributors that have helped us to arrive at this major milestone today. So as I mentioned before, the GEM Foundation is a public-private partnership. We have a number of public sponsors, from civil protection organizations, from geological surveys within countries, as well as ministries of science. We also have private partners, many coming from the insurance and reinsurance industry, but also from engineering companies. And we also work with a number of associate partners, including UNDRR, to work with their networks around the world to spread our information and resources for disaster risk reduction applications. And here at the bottom, we have a number of major contributors that have provided us with resources, data, and models that have contributed to this release, this 2023 release of GEM's Global Hazard and Risk Products. So today on the agenda, we have for you the welcome, which I have just given. I will now be passing over to John Schneider in a moment. Many of you will know that John Schneider was the Secretary General of GEM for 7.5 years, and he passed that role over to me just on the 1st of August this year. So the products that we are releasing today really were developed under the leadership, under the guidance of John Schneider. So he will be telling us a few words about that history of arriving to today, and also linking the products that we're releasing to today's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. Then Marco Pagani, the head of seismic hazards, will talk. Then we will come back to me, and I will do a very brief overview of all of the products that we're releasing today, a shopping list of everything that's being released, before we will then hear more details from, initially, Marco Pagani, the head of seismic hazards. He will be presenting all of the details related to the seismic hazard mosaic. Then Vita Silva, head of risk engineering, will present the same for the seismic risk mosaic. They will both also talk about the future developments, where we see these products going in the future, and what you might expect from GEM in the coming years in terms of new products being released. Then we will pass over to Andres Abarca, who is our product manager at GEM. He's going to make sure that we present to you the best way for you to access all of these products. As I think will become very clear over the next hour or two, we really are releasing a very large number of resources, from global maps down to models at the country, national scale. So he's going to walk through the website and show you how you can access those products. And of course, if you do have hear about any products today and you have difficulty finding them, you can also ask us through the website how to access them. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll pass over to John Schneider, who is working with us now as senior advisor, and ask him to tell us a little bit more about how we got to today.
I can't start my video. Okay, sorry. Thank you very much, Helen. Just 1 second here because I don't seem to have. Okay, there we go. Okay, and my screen is coming up. 1 second. Okay. All right. Thanks very much, Helen, for the introduction. As Helen mentioned, we are releasing these maps and additional products as part of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And it's very clear that GEM's mission and principles are very much aligned, not only with the Disaster Reduction Day, but also with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, something that we've been involved with supporting for quite some time. I want to mention that we've recently had in 2023 a number of earthquakes that have produced considerable damage and loss of life, and these underscore the earthquake risk that is very real worldwide. This reciprocal relationship between disasters and inequality, which is the theme of today, is something that is very much a part of the work that we are trying to do to reduce risk. It's very clear that earthquake risks tend to disproportionately affect poor countries. And then I'll give a very short introduction to the maps, going back to the first release of our maps in 2018. In February of this year, there was a series of earthquakes that impacted Turkey and neighboring Syria, over 50,000 deaths, as all of you, I'm sure, know. In early September, an earthquake struck Morocco. And while this earthquake occurred in a fairly rural area, there were more than 3,000 deaths and 7 million or more affected. And just last week began a series of events in Afghanistan. There have been remarkably 3 magnitude 6.3 earthquakes, over 2,500 deaths. It's important to note, in our case, these maps are produced directly from the models that we are producing worldwide. We generate these maps on request from emergency response organizations, in this case, in particular from the European Emergency Response Coordination Center, as well as through a project called Aristotle that we are involved with, which provides a framework within which we can produce estimates of damage, fatalities, displaced persons for earthquakes upon request. It's important to just take a step back here and look. These results are actually from our new earthquake risk maps. When we look at the ranking of global seismic risk by country according to traditional economic measures. So on the left, you have the average annual losses or expected losses on an annual basis for the when you look worldwide in terms of the losses in terms of US dollars, for instance, then it's not surprising that Japan, the US, China dominate the losses. But when you take the ratio of those losses against the actual value or the actual value of the building stock, then you see a very different picture. You see that the proportional losses are much greater in small islands like Solomon's, countries like Afghanistan, Vanuatu. But you also see in red, what I'm showing here are the lower income countries, according to the World Bank, and you see a disproportionate number of losses affecting those poor countries when you look in terms of the ratio. So, which means that those countries generally would have a much more difficult time recovering economically as a result of major earthquakes. Now, if we look again here at three different loss metrics, we have the same loss ratio as I showed in the previous slide on the left, and the right two graphs show fatality ratios and homeless ratios, which are normalized by the population. So in this case, particularly for fatalities, you see a very large proportion of those being low-income countries. This loss metric is very much driven by collapse of buildings, so very poor construction. Whereas homeless is perhaps more driven by a broad range of damage from moderate through to collapse of buildings. Now, looking at how GEM has developed these models, the collaboration framework is really the sort of the foundation of how we work from local to country level to regional and global, building upon collaborations and partnerships, looking essentially at a multi-level approach, linking local information and actors and initiatives through to a global collection of information, all bound together through a common framework for analysis, the OpenQuake engine, databases, platforms that are all connected to that. And of course, glued together by our principles of collaboration, credibility, openness, and public good. In 2018, we launched the first global hazard and risk maps. I think at that time, it was a huge struggle to get all of this together in one place at one time. I think those maps have stood the test of time, and we have been constantly actually improving the underlying databases and models that support those. But I want to say here that when we look at the hazard map, for instance, it's important to note that it's a mosaic, that it represents, I think, 34 separate maps that were combined together through a common framework, common software in most cases, and built from national to regional level, all using best practice, best state-of-the-art. And when we look at risk, the risk maps, when we look at exposure, the exposure was all built upon a common taxonomy of buildings, JED for all, a wide range of vulnerability functions, which have been, I think all have been released openly as well. These functions are the backbone of the vulnerability model. The exposure is developed from a wide range of information, from national census through to building surveys, global databases such as OpenStreetMap, as well as satellite remote sensing data. And these, important to say that this information has been built has been improved constantly through, or continuously, I should say, through projects together with partners, projects from World Bank, projects from USAID and other donors, and also through projects with our sponsors and other partners. And over time, now this represents a summary of the downloads that we've had of the global hazard and risk maps, with something like 15,000 hazard and 10,000 risk maps having been downloaded in the past 4 years. We actually didn't collect any statistics in the first year, so this could be double that. In any case, we have seen a very broad use of the maps. We are increasingly getting requests for uses of the maps and underlying data for cases that are outside of the traditional engineering and insurance industries. For instance, for ranking of properties for real estate or by banks and others for a wide range of purposes. So with that, I would like to pass it over to back to Helen. Helen's going to give us an overview of our products and what they look like today, and I think a little bit about later about how we can access those. All right, Helen, thanks very much. Over to you.
Thank you, John. Let me share my... Okay, hopefully you'll see my slides. So thank you, John. As you say, I'm now going to do a really very brief, fast overview of all of the products that we're releasing today. And then you will hear more from Marco and Vito of the details of these products, and finally from Andres about how you can access them. So if you go onto our website today under globalquakemodel.org/products, you will see this image here, which are really our flagship global products. So you will be able to access from here directly links taking you to the global hazard map, and from there accessing all of the various hazard resources to the global risk map and the risk resources. Both of these global hazard and risk maps and models have been computed using the OpenQuake engine. The OpenQuake engine is our open source state-of-the-art software for seismic hazard and risk assessment. You will also from here directly access the global exposure model and all of the various models at the national level, and also the global vulnerability model, all of which are being openly released. And also we have a large number of risk profiles for 190 countries in the world. So let me just tell you a few key features about each of those flagship products. So starting with the seismic hazard, the global seismic hazard, as has been mentioned already, it's a mosaic of number of models. And we are releasing today for the first time openly a global seismic hazard map. So you will be able to access the data. There will be a raster file which you can download with the PGA with a 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years or the 475-year return period PGA on rock. You will also be able to access a number of updated hazard models from the mosaic. So through our website directly, you will be able to download input files for the OpenQuake engine to rerun those hazard models and to recompute yourself the seismic hazard metrics. We have our interactive GeoViewer, which has been updated with these latest global seismic hazard maps. And you can also compare between the version from 2018-19 and the latest version. So you'll be able to do a direct comparison and see through that GeoViewer how the hazard has changed. We're also providing through the website a number of downloadable high-resolution image files, including the global seismic hazard map. We hope you will use those in your publications, in your technical reports. And also there is a poster. So back in 2018, there was a poster of the hazard map released. Behind me here, I have the risk map, risk poster. We are releasing an updated hazard and risk poster, and you can download those from the website and print them. When it comes to the seismic risk mosaic, as you will hear about in more detail from Vita in a few moments, we now have 5 different risk metrics, 5 average annual risk metrics that have been computed. So there's the economic loss due to the damage, the replacement of the damage of the buildings. There's the buildings lost. There's the average annual built-up area. There's the average annual fatalities and also homeless. And if you go again to our interactive GeoViewer, you will be able to access those global risk maps for those 5 risk metrics. And you can also download high-resolution image files for each of those global maps for the different risk metrics, and also the poster, so the updated version of the version 2023 poster. When it comes to exposure, the exposure model, we have this year released openly exposure models for 215 countries or territories through a GitHub repository. You can use these exposure models to run calculations yourself with the OpenQuake engine. So they can be formatted to be directly input as CSV files into the OpenQuake engine. So combining those with the hazard models I mentioned before and the vulnerability models, which I'll mention in a moment, you'll be able to run your own risk calculations. There's also a large number of underlying data and resources associated with each of those models on this repository. We also have updated our interactive GeoViewer again with these global exposure maps. So you can see the layers of global exposure for different exposure metrics. We are releasing for the first time an updated global building vulnerability repository. This is the open release of vulnerability models for 215 countries and territories in the world. And so if you go into each of these countries and territories, you can see that the vulnerability models that have been used for the calculations of our global risk products. For the first time, we're releasing separate models for the structural damage, the non-structural damage, the contents, and the fatalities. And again, these are in a format, a so-called XML format, which can be directly put into the OpenQuake engine so you can run your own calculations. And as I mentioned before, we also release not just these global seismic risk maps, but also for each country and territory, a risk profile, which has a number of risk metrics and additional information about the calculations that we have done, not just the average annual results, but also risk curves and losses at different return periods. And so those have been released for 190 countries or territories from around the world. So I'm now going to pass over to Marco Pagani, who will be telling us more about the details of the global seismic hazard mosaic. Marco, let me stop sharing and pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I'm going to share my screen now. So now you should see the right screen, hopefully, yes. So thanks a lot. And as Ellen said, I'm going to give you a brief update on all the changes that we've been introducing into the mosaic and the corresponding results since the original release of the first release of the other results back in 2018. So this is, as always, a big effort for the other teams. Here I have all the members since 2018. Of course, we receive a lot of help also from the IT teams, but this is really an effort that is involving the entire secretariat, the risk team. And not just that, because we have plenty of external organizations that are contributing with their models. And so their contribution, of course, is very much acknowledged. So, as I said, the first release of what we call the mosaic was back in 2018. The mosaic is a collection of seismic hazard models that overall are giving us the capability of calculating hazard at the global scale. And since 2018, we kept constantly, let's say, adding new models or changing the models in order to improve our capability to calculate hazard and give the most reliable results possible. So we do that because clearly the mosaic is really at the core of the activities that we carry out at GEM. It's very important in general terms to appraise what's the level of hazard that we expect, but also for calculating the risk, as you will see later on from Vitor. And by the way, if meanwhile you have any question, feel free to post them on the chat, and we will, of course, be very keen to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So this is the current structure of the mosaic, and the various models are subdivided into the categories that we use in order to incorporate them into the mosaic, because of course we have a sort of a set of criteria, and we give priority in general to the models that are coming from either international projects or from well-renowned national agencies. If for a certain area we don't have that model available, because clearly we need a public model that is accessible, what we do is in general to either search for models that are contributed by organizations that are working with us, and that's the case, for example, for Greenland that you can see here, or for India, where instead we are using right now a model that was published in 2012 from Nathan Pimbajan. If that's also an option that is not available, we promote, of course, depending on the resources and the capabilities that we have, projects with which we develop models in collaboration with local experts, because that's, of course, something that we value a lot. And if we are really not able to establish a collaboration locally, what we do is to develop models internally. And those are the models with this sort of light gray. So, as I said, we made a lot of improvements, and in order to give you a description that is a bit better organized, we separated those improvements into three categories. The improvements that we made in the models, the improvements that we made while running the other calculation, and the improvements in terms of the results that we've been computing. So starting from the improvements that we made to the model, of course, in this case, the improvements can be either in changing some parts of the model or completely replacing a model with a new one. And this is a map that shows you indeed the spatial distribution of the various models that we have in the mosaic. And with this red ellipses, I'm emphasizing the changes that are more affecting, let's say, the overall structure of the mosaic. In particular, in the case of US now, we merged together the model for user-free and the model for the remaining part of conterminous US. In the 2008 model, there were separate models. We added a model for Greenland that was not included back in 2018, and that's, as I said, a model that was contributed from FN Global, which is an organization working with us. And in case of Europe, we decided to use the model from the published by FR in 2020 that is also covering Turkey. So basically, we replaced the model for Turkey that originally was from the Middle East model with the new model from FR 2020. So all those models that in total are 30 are, of course, all implemented for the OpenQuake engine, so readily available for performing an hazard analysis. And they are hosted into an internal repository that we have at GEM, where we are testing constantly those models against the OpenQuake engine in order to make sure that there is always a one-to-one compatibility between the engine, of course, and the corresponding models. And as Ellen said, all the models are available with different licenses, depending on the type of user that is intended, okay? But they are all available, and many of them are freely available directly on the GEM website from today. If we look a bit more in detail to the changes that we've been adding to the models, here you can see three categories. So in pink, we have the models that have been completely replaced by new versions. In light blue, you have the models where we've been changing the ground motion characterization. So basically, we've been replacing all the ground motion prediction equations with more recent ones. And with this, in orange, you have models where we've been changing both parts of the seismic source characterization or the ground motion characterization while maintaining the original structure of the model. So overall, we have, as you can see, a new model from the 2020 new model from Canada, the 2018 model from US, a model from Greenland, as I said, the 2020 model for Europe, a new model for China that we developed internally, a new model for Korea developed internally by GEM, a new model for Papua New Guinea that has been contributed from Geoscience Australia. And we were changing the ground motion characterization in Alaska, Mexico, Western Africa, South Africa, and a bunch of models in Asia. And we've been performing more substantial changes in the seismic source characterization and ground motion characterization in South America and Central America and Caribbean. Moving to the other two categories, so other calculation and results. Regarding the other calculation, what we did was to homogenize the representation of the horizontal component of motion. And so now in the mosaic, all the hazard is represented in terms of the geometric mean. We also changed the number of standard deviations that we use in order to truncate the distribution that is describing the aleatory variability in ground motion, and now we are using 5 sigmas instead of 3, which was the value used in 2018. And we've been homogenizing the minimum magnitude. So now almost all the models are using the same minimum magnitude, and of course this is improving the comparability, the compatibility of the results that we are calculating from different models. In terms of results, we've been doing substantial changes in terms of the grid, the reference grid that we are using for calculating the results. We've been adding a number of intensity measure types, and now we've been also started to perform on a regular basis disaggregation analysis for the main cities all across the world. So just to give you an idea of the changes for the grid, in our calculations, we've been always using a grid that is equally spaced in distance, and that is very important in order to optimize the calculation. So in the past, we were calculating this uniform grid using internal code. In this new version, we moved to a public library, which is called H3, and you can see here the way in which this library is structured, which is a hierarchical, it has a hierarchical structure, this library. And in terms of the how this is converted to the grid that we are using for calculating the results, here you can see 2 other maps for the foothills of the Southern Alps. These are the lakes, Lake Garda, Lake Como, and so on. So this is the grid used for the calculations in 2018, and this is the grid that is used in 2023. So you can see that now we have a far better resolution that is closer to 6 kilometers in terms of spacing between the different points. So moving from the lakes to a more global perspective, here you can see instead the changes that have been, the relative changes between the 2018 map and the 2022. And here you can see that, of course, we have a number of changes where we've been replacing models with new ones. For example, that's the case for the area in China, but also for Europe. And we have other changes that instead are more let's say, more explained, looking at the changes in the ground motion models that have been used for calculating results in the latest version of the global maps. So this is instead the map. This is, of course, PGA, 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years, calculating on reference rock conditions. As Ellen said, now from today, there is a poster and also a high resolution map that is available on the website for you to download. And we have, of course, a poster like the one that has been released back in 2018 with a description of the various components of the model and the map for 10% in 50 years PGA on rock. If you are instead willing to create your own map, you can download the raster. So there is now a raster that can be used to plot this map, and of course you can at that point plot your own map, change the color scale, or do whatever you want compatibly with the license with which the raster is released. From a more general perspective, the default calculations that we perform now at the global scale are including So calculations on reference rock conditions, but also on soil using the VS30 database provided by the USGS. We are calculating results for PGA and a bunch of spectral accelerations ranging from 0.1 to 2.0 seconds. We are calculating uniform Hazard spectra and other maps for 2 return periods. And as I said, we are performing also disaggregation for 5 intensity measure types and 2 probabilities of exceedance. So on the website, it will be also possible to request for a more, let's say, comprehensive set of maps. In the past, we used to release this set of 12 maps, but now, as you saw, we have far more intensity measure types, and of course, we can provide a more comprehensive set of results should any user require that information. Of course, this is where we stand, but we are already looking forward. And in terms of new things that we are already doing in order to improve the mosaic, we are right now filling the gaps. So the mosaic right now is covering the inland areas, but we are not covering the oceans. And so that means that we are not providing information for small islands, for example. And so right now, thanks to the support that we are receiving from USAID, we are working on a project in which we are developing other models for all the oceans. So once all those models will be completed, we will be able to, let's say, calculate hazard in every point of the world. Still in the same project, we are also willing to, let's say, improve our capability to forecast hazard. And in particular, what we are doing is to work at adding the capability to the models to take into account time. So we are working right now at an experimental model for Central America, but clearly with time, we plan to expand that to other models in the mosaic. And we are not just looking at improvements that are on the mosaic, but now we are also working on a bunch of projects in which we are building new products relying on what we have inside the mosaic. One of those projects is called GIS, and within this project, what we are doing is to create finite ruptures and the corresponding ground motion field for the main earthquakes that are part of the ICGEM catalog. So the idea is to create a big repository within which it will be possible for every earthquake to have a rupture and the corresponding ground motion field, which is an information very important in order to understand, for example, if the models that we have in the mosaic are capable to reproduce the seismicity and the ruptures that have been generated in the past, but it's also very useful, for example, for the risk team in order to perform calibrations when they are building their risk models. A second project in which we are working that most probably will generate a service that will be available to users is the ASC Earthquake Loads Overseas, or AILO project. In this case, what we are doing is to develop a framework in the OpenQuake engine within which is possible to calculate the design loads for 2 versions of the IST building code, the ASC 716 and the ASC 722. So we are doing that for about 500 sites outside of US, distributed locally. So that's basically the playground within which we are developing those capabilities. But of course, on top of that, we are also creating a web service with which it will be possible to execute this analysis in every point of the world upon request. And that most probably will be a service that will make available to the public most probably at the end of the project, or maybe even before that. Last point that I want to mention, last improvement, let's say, is the construction of the global stochastic event set. So once we will complete the construction of other models for the oceans, it will be very important to have the capability of generating a stochastic event set that can be compared one-to-one with the observed seismicity. And so in parallel with the construction of those new models, we are also developing new tools with which it will be possible to take stochastic event sets from every earthquake and to combine them into a uniform stochastic event set that is simulating the seismicity at the global scale. So that's my last slide. Again, as Ellen said, I want to thank, of course, all the organizations that have been supporting us throughout the years, and all the organizations within which we are working, all the individuals that maybe are not, let's say, represented by any of the logos that you see here, but they are helping us to provide all these results and to continue with our work. So now I hand it over to Vitor. Vitor is going to describe all the marvelous improvements that they made within the risk model. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marco. As Marco mentioned, I will now continue with the seismic risk counterpart. So once again, I also want to start the presentation by acknowledging all the contributions from everybody. Obviously, since risk appears at the end of this process, we always rely a lot on the support from the Azure team, but also the IT team to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And then, as I will explain a little bit throughout the presentation, we're also quite lucky to have a lot of contributions and a lot of help from many partners around the world to improve the models, to calibrate, providing data, and providing feedback. So Marco just presented this global seismic hazard map, and I will present some of the updates on the different components that is allowing us to convert the global seismic hazard into global seismic risk. First of all, we didn't start from scratch. We started in 2018, as John Schneider presented previously. And something that we actually quite noticed is that exposure has changed quite a lot since 2018. We had 7.6 billion people. There's more people now on Earth, and we also expect the population to increase quite sharply for the next years, which also highlights the need for us to continue improving the models and updating the models. So since the first release of the global seismic risk model, there's another 375 million people, 98 million dwellings, and 73 million buildings. Also, something that a lot of us have felt quite painfully, I have to say, is the massive inflation that we've been having on the different countries. And usually inflation is much higher on the construction costs than on the general products. So this was also something that we noticed, that we had to continuously update the exposure model to take into account the massive increase in construction costs in specific parts of the world. And obviously this has been exacerbated by the global pandemic and the ongoing war in Ukraine. So we have developed several routines, several models to try to update the number of buildings, the number of dwellings. We updated the mapping schemes for the various countries. And we also incorporated new data that has been released since 2018 for some of the countries. Despite the fact that I will show a lot of the maps at the global scale, I just want to mention that we always try as much as possible to follow this bottom-up approach. Ultimately, I will show global maps, but I just want to highlight that a lot of the models are actually extremely detailed because we try to work at the smallest resolution possible. And surprisingly, some massive countries like Canada, United States, China, India, there's actually extremely detailed information to develop these exposure models. And usually some of these models include information not just about the population, the number of dwellings or buildings, but also information about the material of the walls, the material of the floors, sometimes the age of construction, and also the type of roof. And we use this information to convert the different buildings and the different initiative areas into a building class. So after collecting all this information for the majority of the countries in the world and developing national exposure models, we can basically put everything on a single global map. And we also use some world pop information and satellite information to do spatial disaggregation of the assets. And in this map, I'm showing everything on an evenly spaced grid using a hexagonal grid, just so it's easier for us to compare exposure between different countries, because usually the administrative divisions from the various countries differ quite a lot. So this is the number of residential, commercial, and in residential buildings around the world. So this is the number of buildings. It doesn't have anything related to the cost of the buildings or the area of the buildings. But this is also something that we collect and we try to model, we try to calibrate. And in this map here, what we have now is actually the economic value, the value of the buildings, again, on an evenly spaced grid. We can see that the differences from the two maps, we have a massive concentration in specific parts of the world, like obviously Southeast Asia, north of Europe, the east of the United States. And this is in terms of the number of the buildings. Once we start investigating actually the economic value of the buildings, now we see that we have a stronger concentration of property value in the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. This is just a summary of some of the main figures, some of the main numbers that we can take from this global exposure model. We always try to make sure that we validate the model as much as possible. We compare with different countries. We purchase some construction cost books. We compare obviously with studies that have been performed for some of the countries at a much higher resolution level, like for example, in the United States, in some countries in Europe, in New Zealand. And this is what we have so far. The current version of the model has 7.84 billion people, 1.5 billion buildings, 242 billion square meters of construction, and the total value of the global exposure model is at 287 trillion US dollars. Also, something that we tried to do, and this was quite challenging, was to try to divide the cost of the different buildings of the building stock between the structural components and the non-structural components. So these two components form usually what we call the cost of the building. But we also try to include now information about the contents, given that for several parts of the world, and in particular when the buildings are well designed, most of the losses come from contents or non-structural components. So it was quite important for us to try to take this step forward and do this division of the different components. This is just a division now in terms of the three lines of businesses that we include in our exposure model. We have residential buildings, commercial buildings, and industrial buildings. And we can see that in terms of the number, the majority of the buildings are residential, but when we think about the cost, commercial and industrial buildings represent an important fraction of the value of the global building stock, typically because of the contents. They are way more expensive in this type of buildings. This is just my last slide about this global exposure model. This is just a ranking of the top 15 countries in terms of the number of buildings, the replacement cost, and the construction area. This is typically quite important for us to try to do several validations of the model. Do we think the number of buildings compare with different countries, and then also compare with different regions inside of the countries? Is it logical? Is it what one would expect? Is it in line with some of these global reports, for example, from the United Nations or the World Bank? I can tell you that quite often it is not. So this usually makes us take a step back, try to further investigate the details of the model, try to collect additional information, and also try to make sure that we further validate the model and adjust the results. My colleague Andres, which is going to speak after me, will explain you exactly where a lot of these models can be already found. But I can tell you that, for example, the global exposure at the first administrative level, it's already available on the public repo on GitHub. And if for some reason you would like to have additional detail for some of the model, for example, at the smallest available administrative level, or the spatially distributed version of the exposure model for specific countries, Andres is going to explain also how this can be accessed through the website. I also want to mention that if you have already some questions about the exposure, and then I will talk about vulnerability and then the risk, feel free to use also the Q&A feature of Zoom and leave your questions there now. In terms of expanding the vulnerability database, I would say that probably vulnerability is one of the most challenging components in developing a global seismic risk model, because there's so many different methodologies, there's so many different building classes around the world. We have so many different aspects that we have to take into account, like different ground motion records, different damage criteria. So this is something that we continue improving. In 2018, we were considering 544 building classes. Now we have 1,201 building classes, and we apply different loss ratios depending if it's a residential, commercial, or industrial building. So in fairness, right now we have 3,603 vulnerability functions. Towards the end of the presentation, I will explain how we are expanding this particular component of the global risk model. And I can tell you that actually this is going to increase quite a lot towards the dozens of thousands of vulnerability functions. Also separating these different components on the vulnerability, so structural, non-structural, and contents, allow us to understand what are the drivers of risk. So basically now we calculate separately the structural losses, non-structural losses, and contents, and then we aggregate everything at the end. I would also like to mention that we're now taking into account different consequences. So it's not just about economic losses, of course, but because we have a good control on the different components, on the fragility component of these calculations as well. Right now we have functions for the buildings lost, which are basically the buildings that had complete damage or collapse, the area lost, economic losses, fatalities, and also the population left homeless. So basically the number of occupants that were living in houses that now have complete or extensive damage. All of this material is already available, also again on the public repo, and we will continue expanding this with the new vulnerability methodology that I will talk at the end. I don't have much time to go over the impact of the differences on the seismic hazard, and this is a map that Marco presented previously, but just to say that obviously because we had a new seismic hazard component on the global seismic risk model, there are some changes in different parts of the world, and we have evaluated this for specific parts of the world. I don't have time here to go over some of these details, but I just wanted to mention that in some parts of the world, the changes on the seismic hazard were actually more influential than the updates on the exposure or vulnerability. So now going to the global seismic risk assessment. So what we do in this process is we grab this global seismic hazard model that Mark was presented previously. So it's a mosaic of many seismic hazard models. We start generating many events. So we use the OpenQuake engine to do this type of analysis. We could follow the classical PSHA approach, or we can follow also the event-based approach. We do the event-based approach because we want to take into account the spatial correlation on the ground shaking, and also now the interperiod correlation between the different intensity measures that we're using for the calculations. For each one of these events, we always calculate a NASA footprint or a ground motion field. And to do that, we use the logic tree of ground motion models provided and created by the seismic hazard team. So this is just a few events that were automatically generated just for illustration purposes. Then the process that we use is something that is well known. So we have the seismic hazard, we generate many hazard footprints, we check how much is the ground shaking for different intensity measures at the location of the buildings. For each building, we have many vulnerability functions because, as I said previously, we have different metrics that we are now assessing. And finally, we can have these 5 risk metrics that we are now focusing. Moving now to the some of the main results. So we have here the global average annual economic losses. This is as expected. We have high economic losses in some places, for example, south of Europe, both because of the high seismic hazard, unfortunately the high vulnerability of some of the building classes, but also the high construction costs. But obviously all the Himalayan belt, Japan, the west of Latin America also has high economic losses. This is the ranking of the top 15 countries. So as John was mentioning previously, we have the usual suspects on the top, Japan and United States, but then also other countries like China and Turkey because of the high seismic hazard and the high vulnerability. We also have here a ranking when we normalize these losses by the economic value on the different countries. And we can see here now some of the smaller and vulnerable countries on the top of the list. Currently, the model indicates an average general loss of 84 billion US dollars. So this is way higher than the gross domestic product of a lot of countries, and it's definitely way higher than the investment that is done every year in disaster risk reduction. If we ignore now the cost of the buildings and we focus only on the number of buildings destroyed or number of buildings that had complete damage, this is how it looks. And now we can see that we have warmer colors, bright reds, for example, in South Asia, and also in some places in Latin America. This is the ranking, once again, of the top 15 countries in terms of average annual buildings lost and also average annual area lost. For this particular model, we also assessed the human impact. So for each building class, we also evaluated what is the likelihood that we're going to have actual structural collapse. And then if we do have structural collapse, what are the likely fatality rates? We review a lot of work from many colleagues, many researchers around the world in terms of fatality modeling. We also collect a lot of empirical data from recent publications, and we did this global calibration of the fatalities. We try to understand what are the average annual fatalities throughout time. We also brought in the influence of the introduction of different design regulations around the world and how the population has increased in different parts of the world. And based on this empirical average annual human losses, we calibrated our model, our fatality rates and collapse rates to make sure that the current model matches the empirical global loss. This is how the global average annual human losses look like. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we have a very high concentration of fatalities in countries like China and Pakistan, and also in some countries in Latin America. And this is the map that shows the global average number of displaced people. So currently we're using a very simplified methodology that we just assume that if somebody was living in a house that now has complete damage or extensive damage, then this person is going to be left homeless or is going to have to be displaced, at least in temporary shelters. But we're also working on some methodology to try to make sure that we do a better job at predicting the number of displaced people. I want to mention that depending on the risk metric, we're going to have different rankings of the countries. This is true across the different countries, but this is also very true even if we look inside of the country. This is, in my opinion, quite important because some disaster risk reduction measures, the allocation of funding, in the last years, we've seen a lot of examples that the funds are distributed across a country or between countries, proportional to the earthquake risk or the disaster risk. But depending on the risk metric you're focusing on, this ranking might change quite considerably. And I just included here the case of Indonesia, which appears on the 5 metrics. All this information is typically summarized on what we call the risk profiles for countries and territories. So we try to summarize in a single page what we believe is the most important information. So from seismic hazard, exposure, average annual human losses, and also loss ratios, the ranking of the regions with the highest risk, and also the building classes that are contributing the most to the risk. The information behind these country profiles, it's also available, but this is basically perhaps for a less technical audience and to have a good idea of what's available. The country profiles are also going to be available on this public repo, and this is also something that this is going to talk about. Finally, as Marco mentioned previously, we have now 2 posters. Marco presented the one for seismic hazard. This is the one that we produced for seismic risk. It's a little bit different from the one that we produced in 2018. So we decided to include on the top the global map of average annual loss of built area. This is basically to take into account or to try to neglect the fact that buildings might be more expensive in different parts of the world. Also to take into account in some parts of the world, the type of construction, we can have not a lot of buildings, but these buildings might have a huge area and host a lot of people. We have the ranking that I was mentioning previously. We have the seismic hazard and the global exposure maps. So users can have a good idea of what was the ingredients to produce this map. And then we also have some text explaining GEM, this map in terms of uses. And again, the main sponsors and partners that contributed to the development of this map. The poster, the different maps in PNG are all also available already on the products page. So this is also something that is going to be presented. Finally, I just want to mention something about the future developments. This is something we've been already working for some time, even before the release of these models. So an area where we know that we need to continue improving quite a lot is on the vulnerability side. So previously, because we had so many building classes, more than 1,000 building classes, we're using nonlinear time history analysis on signal degree of freedom systems. But there's some limitations with this approach, because in order for us to develop vulnerability models that properly capture the damage and non-structural components that might be acceleration sensitive, we need to be able to extract additional engineering demand parameters from this model. And this is something we're doing now with these stick and mass models. Moreover, we had a ton of requests for vulnerability functions in terms of business disruption or disruption of functionalities, for example, for critical facilities. And again, we need to do a better modeling of the damage on the non-structural components. And this is something that we hope with this new approach, we will be able to do. Moreover, we're also comparing the simplified approaches with extremely detailed approaches with 3D modeling of some real structures to understand if the simplifications that are done in this process ensure that basically the models are still realistic. Also, something that we hear all the time is, what about earthquake triggered hazards? So basically liquefaction, landslides, tsunamis, and fire following. We've been doing some tests. This is extremely complex to do at the regional scale, because a lot of these hazards are pretty much, site dependent. But we've been doing a lot of tests with the hazard team, and we think some of the models are quite promising. There's also a few models that were proposed by the USGS, at least to highlight places where additional, more detailed tests have to be carried out. And this is something that we also want to start releasing soon, at least the results of some of these studies. As I mentioned previously, the current model all includes residential, industrial, and commercial buildings, but we know from the impact of past events that the damage on healthcare, education, and also cultural heritage can be quite high. And this is something that is still missing on the global exposure model of GEM. We started already including healthcare infrastructure in some parts of the world as part of some USAID projects, and also the World Bank in Europe. But this is something that we need to do more systematically at the global scale and for other countries. I also want to say that a lot of the losses, all the losses that I was presenting are based on direct losses, but currently the model is neglecting direct losses, which can actually be much higher than the direct losses for some countries, like for example, Japan. And this is something that we also understand. We have used simplified methodologies in the past for Central Asia within a project with the Asian Development Bank. And this is something that we would like to further investigate in the future. And finally, something that we've been doing quite frequently, because basically the organizations in charge of some of the projects that are given to GEM have been asking, is to take into account also future risk. And I think this is quite important, because if the idea, and in particular on this day, the Disaster Risk Reduction Day, is to use some of this results, some of this models and data and information from GEM in risk reduction, I think it's quite important that the risk reflects not just the current risk, but also how the risk is expected to evolve in the future. Finally, this is my last bullet point and also my last slide, just to say that currently I presented, for example, the number of people that are expected to perish every day due to earthquakes, or the amount of population that has been displaced. But we need more information about who are these people. So, and I think this might bring a little bit more equity and risk. So to add a little bit more information about the socioeconomic conditions of some of the people that we are including in these maps. And with that, I just want to also to thank all the partners that have been supporting GEM, and without them, it would have been impossible for us to release all these products today. So this is my last slide. I will obviously answer, Q&A. We also have time for Q&A later on. But now I'm going to pass to my colleague Andres, who is going to show how some of these products, how some of these models and data sets can be accessed through the new pages that have been included on the GEM website.
Thank you very much, Vitor. And thank you, everybody, for participating and connecting. I see that we have over 200 people participating live. So that's great attendance. And thank you very much for being here. Please remember, if you have any questions for Vitor or Marco or anything that's being said here, use the Q&A section in the Zoom bar. So I'm very excited about today's event. Obviously, as a product manager, a release of open products has a great impact on my day-to-day. Since you've already heard what the products are, in what it is that how it is that they've been produced. I'm only going to focus on access. So the main way that everybody can access information right now is through the products page. So I'm going to, since this is all about access, that I'm going to go through the actual website that everybody can use. Now, this website is currently live, globalquakemodel.org/products. Since we have over 200 people connected, everybody sitting in front of a computer, I wanted to ask you, please resist the temptation of going into the website and start clicking at everything that I'm clicking. Because if you do that, I might have problems with navigation if we have a lot of traffic. And if that happens, it's going to slow me down. It's probably going to make me look really bad. So please don't do that. So this is how the products page currently looks. We have a small description at the top. All of the flagship products are highlighted. And then we have a map view and a list view and a gallery view down that has the inventory of everything that we're releasing today. I'm going to leave this for later, come back in a minute, and I'm going to go through each one of the flagship products and show you each one of the versions and resources that are available for you. So I will start with the global hazard map. This is probably the most flagship of all the flagships, is the one that gets requested and distributed the most. This is the way that all the product pages look now. This has been also refurbished for today's release. So we have a small description. We've done our best to describe the product, provide some overview of the main features and the different versions that may be available. How to cite this work: whenever there's a publication, a scientific publication that's available, we use that as a citation. And if not, maybe citations to the repositories, or we provide some way of citing the work. Available versions, which kind of describes the things that are available into each one of the buttons that I'm going to go over here. And some license information that goes over the restrictions of the different licenses that each product that we're making available. So we have the bottom related products that might be useful if anybody's interested for related information to the product that you're seeing. So going over each one of the bottoms at the beginning, so we have open version download for the hazard map. If you go here, now you're going to be able to go directly to a cloud service where you're going to be able to download directly the raster map. Now this is great. Before, you used to need to request a license, and that product would have been given to you, but now it's anybody can come over here and you're going to get access to the actual information. Inside of the zip that you're going to download, you're going to find the license information, a small README that has some information that is going to be useful, as well as the color schemes that we use if we want to reproduce the color schemes of our representations of the map, as well as the actual raster file. As Marco mentioned, you're going to be able to use that for your calculations, your reports, whatever you need, as long as you respect the license terms. I will jump the GeoViewer for now. We also have high-resolution PNG files for each one of the maps that we're releasing so that you can include in your reports. We have the poster download. Marco already mentioned about what the poster is and what's the information that's available. You can download it directly. You have access to the documentation. So this is going to take you to the documentation website for the hazard models, where you're going to be able to access the documentation of each one of the models in the mosaic. You're going to be able to get license requests. So this is available for each one of the products. If you see that, I don't know, you're going to use a product commercially that you're not supposed to, or you can't respect the license conditions that are being offered, or there's a product that's restricted only with a license request, then you can click on that button, fill out the information. We'll evaluate your use case and we'll be given the information. Now, finally, we have the GeoViewers. These GeoViewers are available for most of the maps that we're releasing. I'm going to get this out of the way for a minute. This is really cool, actually. So now we have this split view where you can see different versions of the map. So on the left, you're seeing the 2019 version, and on the right, you're seeing the 2023 version. So this is really cool. You can explore it, and you're going to be able to see the differences. I'm zooming in on the GEM headquarters here. On the left, you're going to see, so the difference in the values, but not only the difference in the values, but also the differences in the resolution. Because as Marco mentioned, we have almost 3 times the point density that we had for the previous map. So that's actually quite better resolution than we had before. If you click on any point of the map, you're going to be able to see the actual values for each one of the locations. So the comparison of the values as well for the 2019 and 2023 versions. If you would like not to see the split screen, then you can just click on this button over here. You unsplit the map and you can choose which layer you want to see, the previous one or the current one. So that's for the hazard map. I'm going to skip the OpenQuake engine because that one really hasn't had many changes. This is a new website, let's say, for the landing page of OpenQuake, but it really just redirects you to the OpenQuake GitHub project, which has been there for a few years now. So there's not much new. Going into the exposure model. So all pages look the same. We've taken the same format in terms of description, how all of the sites look. In the case of exposure, one of the new innovations that we're doing is that for the first time, we're releasing the actual exposure files in the GitHub repository. Now, this repository has been available for a while, but the difference now is that before, the information that used to be available inside of each one of the folders was the information that you needed if you wanted to reproduce the summaries that are available at the bottom of each page. Now, if you go into each folder, you're actually going to find the values for the residential, industrial, and commercial exposure aggregated at administrative level 1. And it has all the taxonomies that we use. It's basically the same files that we use, but aggregated at admin level 1. Now, this information is also available at a much higher resolution, but that one's not being openly released, but you can also request it through the license request. There's also a documentation site, which is new. It's still actually in construction. Not all the regions have been completed, but we also give access to the risk model documentation. There are PNGs as well, the high resolution maps for you to include in your reports for buildings and value. You can look them over there, download them as well. And there is the GeoViewer as well. So in this case, the GeoViewer works exactly the same. You have the 2 layers, building count and economic value, and you have the split screen view as well, where you can build the comparisons that you want. Oof, perfect. So as you can see here, as Vitor was mentioning, this is really cool because you can see different stories, right? Depending on the metric that you choose. For example, on the left, you're seeing in green building count. So if you look, for example, compare India to Europe, they look as if they had like very similar, if not India with higher density. But if you look at the economic value, you see how it concentrates a lot more. It looks a lot more dense in Europe, which kind of makes sense because of the construction. So this is really cool features that we're including now. Okay, so I think that's it for the exposure model. For vulnerability, what's new and what is great is that we are releasing it as a GitHub repository. So the vulnerability model has been available around because it was available as part of a publication that came out a couple of years back. Now, the issue with that is that it was a kind of a static view of the vulnerability curves that we use. And that's not very, well, I mean, it is very useful, but it's very difficult to keep track and update. So now we're migrating it to this repository, which has all the benefits of Git. So now we're going to be able to have a very transparent view of the versioning and control of all the issues that may come up. So you have all the useful information over here. And if you go, it's aligned with the mosaic of risk. So you can go into each one of the regions and each one of the countries. And you're going to find the actual vulnerability curves that we use for structural, non-structural, contents and fatalities, as well as how to map them with the taxonomy. As Helen was mentioning before, so this is XML files. They're formatted to work with OpenQuake. So the values are right here. So if you want to include them in your scripts, use them for whatever it is that you need, respecting the license, you can take the values from there. Also, there's the documentation site, which has been out for a while, but now it can be accessed directly from there. We've made a great deal of effort so that everything can be accessed through the website. So finally, the global risk. So for this case, we have as well the PNGs for each one of the metrics or some of the metrics that were presented before. You can get those for your reports. You can download the poster as well. Vitor already described the poster pretty well, so I'm not going to do that. Just going to let it load here for a second. There you go. Also access to the documentation from before and also access to the GeoViewer. Again, the GeoViewer has all the same features as before. We have each one of the metrics that were chosen before. You can see them, or you can choose the side-by-side bar, which again is really useful if you want to tell different stories. For example, if I put economic losses on the left, human losses on the right, you're going to be able to see, for example, in America, how economic losses, I don't know, United States compared to Latin America, it looks quite dense in terms of losses. But if you look at the story in terms of human losses or fatalities, the loss is quite different, right? It just looks as a different density, and that has to do with the differences in exposure and vulnerability in those regions. So all really cool features. Oh, one thing that I failed to mention over here is that if you click on any point of the map, you're going to be redirected to the country or territory profiles, which are summaries that I'm going to discuss right now. So I'm actually kind of spoiling myself. So finally, for the risk profiles, so we have country territory, seismic risk profiles. As Helen mentioned, we have it for 190 country or territories. And this also was available through our website before as static PDFs, but now we've migrated them to Git so that we can have that transparent versioning control and be able to include a lot more information that's going to be useful for people to actually understand the information that's in the risk. So there's explanations of the content, related data sets, what publications can you see, what the license condition, questions. You're going to be able to go into each one of the countries as well, each one of the regions, inside each one of the folders, and you're going to find the profile over there, a small overview, and some reference years of all the information that's included on the profiles. So for example, these are reference years for the social indicators that are included. Now, these are really cool seismic risk profiles. It includes very key information for stakeholders to see at a glance what's the situation for seismic risk in their country or territory. So that's it for flagships. So also we have over here the list of everything that's available. So this is an inventory of everything. We can see it as a map view, as a list view, or as a gallery view. So if you go into the map, for example, you can click at any point in the world and you're going to see the different things that we have available. So for example, if you want to access the South America hazard model, you click over here, it's going to land you into the page of the South America hazard model. So in this case, for example, this is how it would look. We have in the description explained that you have two versions, one version that is open under a Creative Commons license and the other one that's restricted on the license request. The publication that's available, the different versions, what's up with the license information, what can you do and what can you do. And if you click on open version download, it's going to lead you to the same cloud service as before, where you can directly download without any information you have to give, anything. You just click on the button, you can directly download all of the open quick files for you to run your hazard calculations. For example, it might look different for each one of the regions. What happens with us is that we have, so the mosaic for hazard and risk don't always align. So what we've done is, for example, for Africa, if you click on Africa, is going to lead you to 4 different regions, which is aligned with the hazard mosaic. So this links is going to take you to each one of the hazard pages for the hazard models of this mosaic. In the case of exposure and vulnerability, it's going to lead you to the same page, all of these links, basically because the risk mosaic does have Africa. Also, you can type in any country and you're going to get forwarded to the GitHub repository for that specific country. So for the specific folder of Algeria, the specific folder for vulnerability of Algeria, and the specific folder for the risk profile in their current or respective GitHub repositories. That's for the map. The list and gallery views are pretty much the same. It's just a matter of the view. I personally prefer the list one. So we have the entire inventory of products over here. Right now, we've cut down the list to 55 products. It used to be over 130, but it's not that we're cutting out products. It's just that we were simplifying things a lot. Before, different versions of the same product used to be different entries. There were like 3 or 4 entries for the hazard map because there was the poster, the PNGs, the GeoViewer, all these different entries. So now we're simplifying all of those links, having all the information being a bit more accessible. And over here, you can apply filters. So for example, if you're interested in all hazard models that have a CC by SA, then you can just filter it over here and you're going to be able to find all of the sites. And if you click on the name of the product, it's going to lead you to each one of the product pages. Where at the same, you're going to be able to find then all of the key description information, what's the license, open version download, and get all of the access to all of our products. So I think that's it for me. So I pass it back to, well, we have a Q&A session right now, which is going to be led by John. I have John right next to me, right? It's not that.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Andres. Yeah, we have lots of time for. We have a fair bit of time for questions, and we note that there have been a number of questions posed through the Q&A. And again, feel free. In fact, that's the only way you can directly ask a question is through the Q&A channel. We've been attempting to answer some of them directly, particularly where they seem to be where they are very specific questions and can be answered more simply through the Q&A channel. But we would like to take some more general questions. The first one that I'd actually like to pose back to Andres. There have been a few people have asked about how to access the information. I know you went through it, but if people have questions about how to get to the products, obviously they can go into the web page and they can start searching around. But if all else fails, who should they contact?
There are several buttons in the website. For example, if you go at the end of the main page, you're going to see haven't found a product, send us a request. If you want more information, click here, or inside of each one of the pages also the license request. All of those buttons kind of lead to my email account. So then anybody, if you ever get lost over there, just click on any one of those buttons, fill out a form, and I'll get the question and we'll take care of it. I'll redirect it if it's something too technical or specifically to each one of the teams, or I'll deal with it myself if it's something dealing with distribution and access.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andres. I have a question from Marzia Santini, directed at Vitor. She's particularly interested in knowing some of the main data sources for the exposure model. I think you may have covered that fairly quickly, Vitor, but if you could elaborate a little bit.
Sure, thank you, John. Yes, I was just, I'll just share very quickly here my screen. I shouldn't be muted.
No, I can hear you, Vitor.
Okay, yeah, I think it should be working. Yeah,
You're
thank
still
you.
muted.
I'm not John.
Isn't he?
Can anyone tell John that I'm
He's
not? Yeah. So yes. So as I just want to mention that on the repo about the exposure model, in terms of the the data sources for the exposure, we actually included in all the different regions. There's a folder called metadata, and usually this file includes the information about where the information came, for example, for the residential buildings or industrial or commercial. For the data sources from the different countries differ completely. We go from countries that basically have specific information about the number of commercial or industrial establishment, the number of businesses, to countries that have absolutely no information. And the only thing that we have is, for example, the workforce. So basically how many people are working on the different sectors. And then we basically need to apply some conversion factors to convert the number of people working in different sectors into what would be the expected number of buildings. But this information has been included on this repo, and it's already available. Yes, also something that it's included on the metadata, it's the mapping schemes. So basically to try to understand how the raw data from the different countries was converted into a set of building classes. This is also something that is included here. I just want to mention something that I didn't do in my presentation, is that one of the reasons we have included all this information also on Git. It's obviously because this way we can keep, different versions, and people can see how the models, improve and are changed over time. But it was also because this way, if you find errors, if you want to provide a new mapping scheme, if there's a new data set that is now available, there is, different mechanisms on Git for you to create, different issues and to provide feedback. And for example, I just noticed that this was just opened 2 days ago. Somebody said, Afghanistan doesn't have commercial buildings at initiative level 1, and there is already some issues, for example, with the initiative boundaries. So this is something that, instead of being just jam, obviously developing this in collaboration with the partners, it's open this to the rest of the community to continue improving the models. So hopefully a little bit like the Wikipedia approach.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Vitor. I'd like to ask a follow-up on the exposure model. One thing that we get asked quite frequently is, I think there's a general assumption that the work we do, of course, is focused on earthquake risk, and sometimes surprise that perhaps the exposure model might be applicable to other hazards. But could you explain a little bit, Vitor, the extent that how the data model for exposure is in some ways tuned for earthquake, and perhaps in other ways how it's actually quite general and can be applied for other types of risk assessment for other hazards?
Yeah. So first of all, the way that we classify the building stock, it follows what we call JED for all taxonomy. It's a global earthquake database for all taxonomy. This was initially developed focusing mostly on earthquakes, but there were already some features that were relevant for other natural hazards. But then a few years ago, as part of this Challenge Fund World Bank project, we expanded this taxonomy, and we did this workshop with many stakeholders in London to try to understand what are the additional attributes, the additional options that we need to include on this building classification system to make sure that we can also cover important attributes for floods, for tsunami, for storms, for fire. So the taxonomy has been already extended to make sure that it covers other perils. Then in terms of what about the exposure? Is it already compatible, for example, with flood risk analysis, landslides, tsunamis? I would say not currently, because right now we have a lot of information that is, for example, at the smallest administrative level. For some countries, it's extremely small. For example, as I was mentioning, China, India, France, the data was developed at Portugal at a very small level, but it might still require further spatial disaggregation. For example, we are in projects which include flood risk modeling, and the partners usually do this spatial disaggregation of the buildings on a 30 by 30 meters. So what I will say is that I think the current data is extremely useful for risk assessment due to other natural hazards, but it might require some improvements in terms of the spatial resolution, and in some cases also in terms of the attributes of the buildings, like for example, the presence of basements or the type of roofs. But I can tell you that we are right now in many projects with flood partners and partners on the landslide side, and the primary source of exposure data is the one that we have at GEM.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vitor. Shifting a little bit here, I have a question from Muhammad Arif. Now, his question is very specific, but I think it indicates a general type of question that perhaps we should answer. This person is looking for fragility and vulnerability data for a specific building class, and he's asking how he might be able to get the required data. So for this type of question, what's the best way for people to touch base with us and perhaps get the desired information they want, how best to use the data sets?
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. This is actually a very good question because it's a question we receive all the time. So I'm glad that this was brought up. So all the information, the input information for the fragility and vulnerability model that we do at GEM is publicly available. I will paste the link to the vulnerability documentation, which is available online while answering this live, and I can also put just on the general chat for other people to see. But all the information from the ground motion records, from the capacity curves, the damage criteria, everything is already available, so everything can be shared. I also want to mention, I will take advantage of this question to mention another two things about the vulnerability, which is also something that a lot of people ask. First of all, can this be used, for example, for specific buildings? Well, it depends if the assumptions that we did for the different building classes are compatible with the specific building that you are analyzing. If you see that basically our assumptions in terms of the capacity, the damage criteria, the main failure mechanism is not compatible with your building, then certainly not. But what I want to say is that it's not just about the functions. The software that we use to develop the vulnerability functions, what we call the vulnerability models toolkit, it's also open source, is also available online. And I was quite happy to see that it has been used already in specific projects for specific countries. So you can take some of the basic ingredients, you can change them, and then you can use these tools, which are already publicly available and obviously free and open source, to develop your own models. For example, just mentioning on the capacity curves, I've seen, for example, I think it was University College of London that used the ingredients from these models now to develop, for example, damage dependent fragility and vulnerability functions for all these building classes. I think there's a lot of value in making sure that more information is available online. The second part, John, and I promised I'll be very quick, is just when you will go now to the GitHub, and as Andres was showing previously, you will see that there's sets of vulnerability functions for the various countries. But for example, you might find that Adobe in Algeria are the same functions that Adobe in Pakistan, okay? Or specific type of concrete will be the same in different countries. This is true. So basically what we did was we grab our global vulnerability data, which is, as I mentioned, more than 3,000 functions. And then what you will find on the different folders are the specific functions that were used for these specific countries. It doesn't mean necessarily that obviously reinforced concrete in Algeria now seems to be the same as reinforced concrete in Japan. No, because what happens is that on the exposure side, on the mapping scheme that is also on the folder, you will see that, for example, for Japan, we probably have reinforced concrete shear walls, high ductility, high code. And then for some of this, let's say, countries with more informal construction, we would have more moment frames with, let's say, non-ductile and probably low code. So there's obviously some differences here, but for some countries, obviously, they were always going to share some of the vulnerability functions.
Okay, thanks, Vitor. I have a question. Sorry, I'm hitting you with a number of questions here that seem to be quite a lot of interest in the risk. A question from Nigel Winspear, actually one of several. So Nigel, apologies if we don't get to all of them, but this one in particular I thought might be worth providing an answer live. Are your damage functions suitable for individual buildings or aggregate zones? Obviously, the two can be very different in terms of the outcome. I think this perhaps is an important thing to be clear on when you're doing localized studies.
Yeah, I think I already partially answered this question before, but I will also say that if we have included certain sources of uncertainty in our functions, which are not applicable, for example, if you're doing individual buildings. For example, we have the building to building variability in our functions, but if you're doing an individual building, you might want to adjust the capacity to the specific properties of that building. I will also say that if you're doing individual buildings, then you might know exactly where is the location of the buildings. So you might want to use a suite of ground motion records for the nonlinear time history analysis, which are specific for this building and not something just general that we use for this global vulnerability and risk analysis. So again, I think some of the ingredients that we have put online are useful, but I would definitely recommend you to adjust the input models and also use the risk models toolkit if you want to follow the same methodology.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Vitor. I'd like to just shift a little bit. Have a question here from Sia. It says Sia Consulting, I guess. Can we expect a liquefaction model at the global level to be out soon from GEM? I could say no, but I think it depends. This is perhaps Marco would like to answer this with a little more detail. Marco, what are we doing on liquefaction, and perhaps you might want to mention other secondary hazards while you're at it.
Okay, can you hear me, John? I cannot start my video. I don't know why.
I can hear you.
We'll take care of that.
Okay, sorry. Okay, now
There you go.
okay. So liquefaction is indeed a topic that is highly debated, and as Vitor explained in his presentation, we are definitely working on it, but I wouldn't say that we will have soon a global model that is, let's say, accounting for liquefaction. Of course, it depends a lot what soon means, but it's one topic on which we are working, and there is an intention to incorporate also liquefaction in the calculation of losses in the midterm, let's say. Well, much depends also on let's say, opportunities. So if anyone has a project that is willing to have with us on liquefaction, of course, that is very welcome, and it will help us a lot to progress more rapidly.
So Marco, perhaps you could say a little bit about what you see as the biggest challenges there. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, to do liquefaction in a very detailed way requires an amount of information that simply is not available even at the local level in most communities. So what sorts of shall I say approximations or how do you deal with this scaling problem to take a very complex problem and bring it up to something that makes sense globally?
Well, I don't have the answer. Otherwise, we would already have the model. So there are, of course, various opinions. And my one, of course, is very biased by experience that I had in the past, especially during the initial part of my career when I've been working on seismic microzonation. And so I've been able to appreciate a lot how variable can be the response locally, depending on the geology that you find. So my will, as I've been discussing with Vitor, is definitely to try to work on some areas where you have a lot of information and try to understand if what we are able to model locally then can be extended to larger areas. There have been already a lot of work and there are a lot of publications, but at least the little experience that we had so far show that it's very difficult to extrapolate what you find for a certain area. So if you develop, say, a liquefaction model for Christchurch and using that for other areas is challenging. Vitor is looking at that more globally together with Lana. That's, of course, an opportunity, a viable approach. Let's see what comes out of that. There might be other ideas that we might test, but at least on our side. Go on, Vitor.
Oh, sorry, Mark. I just wanted to compliment just to say that, liquefaction and landslides, it's actually something that obviously falls on the hazard category. but it's something that we are bombarded all the time, because every time that I present risk, people ask me, what about losses from liquefaction, landslides? And then there's all these different examples in different parts of the world where, more than 50% of the losses were due to the earthquake-triggered deserts and not necessarily due to ground shaking. I think there's also this new era of available data and also new algorithms for us to try to predict these complex behaviors. For example, on the liquefaction, there's the new generation of liquefaction database, which for the first time is giving us a lot of data about the geotechnical conditions and what was observed. There was also this liquefact project in Europe that also collected some data. We've been testing a lot of these models, models from the 70s, from the 90s. I have to say they were not very promising, or at least when we compare with some of the observations, they were not something that would be very easy for us to incorporate on the global model with the current results. But the more recent models that use more information, the actual ground shaking, and combined with some of these new algorithms, random forest, for example, having given us some more promising results. And as Marco said, one of our PhD students is looking at all these different models and doing a lot of tests. So in my opinion, I don't think I would say soon, but I want to emphasize that it's not like we're not doing nothing. We're investigating these models, and if indeed I think that at least they are able to tell us these are locations where we need some additional detailed studies, and then perhaps we cannot do a detailed study for an entire country like we have now a project in Bangladesh, but we can try to highlight the places where perhaps additional resources should be dedicated to do these detailed studies.
So would you see the possibility of a perhaps a simplified approach in the first go, something perhaps more akin to what's often been done in landslide hazard assessment, where you identify a susceptibility or a high, medium, low probability type of thing? Would that be a short-term solution to get something out, or do you see that as not particularly useful?
There are two options there. One is the one that you're saying. The other one is actually to try to incorporate into our models more detailed models for the urban areas that are, let's say, concentrations of risk. And because it's also true that we don't need to have the same detail everywhere. So there are areas where it's not important to have a very, very high resolution analysis, and other areas instead where it's very important. So that's another approach that we might want to consider. And the drivers of risk in many countries are indeed the few large urban centers, and maybe those are the areas from where it would be possible to start by testing this approach of merging high resolution models, including site response, because that's also another aspect that we are dealing with, but in a very, let's say, simplified manner. Okay, using the VS30 front topography is an option, but certainly not the most precise one.
Okay, thanks, Marco. So obviously a very active area of research and a complicated one. There's not a right approach, but and those of you who do have interest and or perhaps some knowledge of the subject, we're always happy to discuss and certainly keen to incorporate data from our partners. Question here from George Andrea. He asks, on the seismic risk side, will it be possible to access the simulated worldwide event set that is used in the global quake model? I think the same question could be posed for hazard as well.
Yeah, I noticed that Marco just turned off his camera, but I think this is actually a question for Marco.
Yeah.
Well, yes. So maybe let's explain a bit more in detail. As we explained during the presentations, all the models are available. Okay, Some of them are available freely, so by just clicking a button, basically, because they are, let's say, released with a license that is giving you immediate access. Some others are also available upon request, and depending on the type of use that you are planning to do, we will decide the type of license that is necessary to be attached to it. But so we don't have at the moment a data set with the ruptures and the corresponding ground motion fields that covers the globe, and you can take to calculate the hazard exactly in the same way that Vitor had been showing. And indeed, the calculations that we are doing on the hazard as well on the risk side are done covering, let's say, just portions of the globe, not we don't do an analysis that is one run for the entire globe. Okay, that's the approach that you need to follow for the time being. We are planning, as I explained at the end of my presentation, to also create a global stochastic event set, fully homogenized, and that's a product that will be most probably available, say, within 1 year, a couple of years from now, depending on how quickly we progress, because of course that's not the only activity, but there's a lot of interest around it, and so we might want to prioritize a little bit more that work now.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there's been a great deal of interest in GEMS, a broader range of global products, you might say. So certainly we've issued since 2018 the global hazard and risk maps and a version of the exposure as well. But over time there is interest in products such as stochastic event sets and impact maps for either scenarios or for stochastic event sets and so forth. So obviously any of these things can be produced as a result of having the underlying models. So if you have particular interest in exploring these areas, we're always happy to discuss it with you. Okay, so let's see if I have another one we can end. Do I have we have 5 more minutes for Q&A?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
I think we can do one more.
Okay. Let me shift. One question that came up earlier, I think, was around the combination when we produce a mosaic of models. There are always differences at the boards between models. How do we reconcile those differences in hazard or risk? Perhaps Marco, you could address this first.
Sorry, John, I didn't get you for a second in my connection. Can you?
How do we reconcile or might say smooth the differences across borders between models? There are a number of cases where we have models that overlap, and then you have some differences one side to the other in the results.
It depends what you need to do in terms of the analysis and the results that you need to calculate.
Well, let's say for the global map. For the global map,
how
do you deal with it?
right now, what we've been doing was to basically assign every model to a subgrid, okay, of the one that is covering the entire globe. And then a posteriori, what we do is to merge or to homogenize the hazard at the borders through a procedure that is described in the paper that we published in 2020.
Are there some areas where you still see that as a particular problem?
If the goal is to have a model that is completely homogeneous, of course, there are areas. The most famous one, let's say, is between the northern border of United States and Canada. Okay, but there are many other examples, and of course that is posing a challenge when you are willing to have a model that is truly homogenized. But we cannot impose that. It's a process. Of course, we are keen to work and help to the extent is possible to say go in the direction of having a model that is more and more homogeneous. But in some cases, unless we take internal decisions that are changing some of the models that we rely on, like the US one and the Canada, otherwise that's not a goal that we will be able to achieve in the short term. And we might consider actually having two versions at a certain point, one that is taking exactly the original model. So basically what we are doing right now, and maybe having another model that is a modified version, which is the one that is fitting into a mosaic that is also completely homogenized and without duplications of sources.
Okay, thanks, Marco. Let me move on to another. I think, what did I want to say here? Oh, okay, on open models. We talk about many different licenses for models that can be very, very confusing to some people. Obviously, the new product page is trying to address at least some confusion around what a license pertains to what model. If you do have questions about those, obviously you can send those to us. A question I would pose is: do we see GEM releasing more models openly in the future? And I guess if we are, if I'm a researcher and I want to have access to a model and it's not open, how do we go about contacting GEM to make it available? I would add that we will make any model available for public good or research applications if you ask, and we will consider your requests. Perhaps Helen would like to answer this question around open models and their availability.
Sure, I'm very happy to. I was also even going to ask Andres as our product manager, but I'm happy to answer. So all of the models are available for public good use. So as I think Andres has already mentioned, if there is anything that you don't find immediately downloadable from our website and open, you can contact us and request to use it. And we will evaluate that use, and if it is for public good, of course, all of those models can be used. We will continue to update all of the open models that we have put out there. So you will see improvements. We will continue to make all of the improvements openly available as well. So does that answer your question, John? And if I might, I saw we have a question here from Ting Lin, who is, what is your vision for the future of GEM? So I thought that could be potentially a good question to finish on. Perhaps I should be the one to take that up now that I have taken over the reins from John as Secretary General of GEM. There's many things in GEM's future, but one thing that has come up a little bit in the discussions as well is our desire to work more with other natural hazards communities. So we've talked a little bit about whether GEM will produce liquefaction and landslide hazard maps. Tsunami, I think I saw in the questions, came up as well. There's a very strong global tsunami community. And so we want to work more with the tsunami community, the geotechnical engineers, to make sure that our global products are being used for other natural hazards as well. And not just on the hazard side, but as has also been mentioned by Vita, the exposure models. Our exposure models have been initially developed with a focus on seismic risk assessment, but the taxonomy allows for them to be expanded to other for use with other natural hazards. So we do want to work with those other natural hazards communities to make sure that our exposure models and those resources can be used for global risk assessment, not just of earthquakes and seismic risk, but of a number of different natural hazards. So that's kind of where I see our vision. And Ting Lin, who asked this question, I know she's been working on sea level rise. And I think that's an example of global sea level rise, bringing that in, for example, into liquefaction assessment and looking at coastal areas where liquefaction susceptibility may increase in the future. One thing that we're also doing in GEM is future exposure models. So what is the built environment going to look like in 2030, 2050? And I can see some interesting ideas of combining that with global sea level rise in 2030, 2050, and many, many ways in which we can use our products to work with other communities. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the vision of GEM is for a world that is resilient to earthquakes, but also other natural hazards. And that's how we see us completing that vision and working towards that vision. So if I may, I would just sort of wrap up here. So I just thank John for that Q&A session, for handling it so well. I think while I'm doing this 5-minute sort of or 2-minute closure potentially, our colleagues will continue to answer the questions, typing in answers. So please do stay around to if you haven't had your question answered, because they will be typing answers in so that you can make sure that you see the answer to your question. So I would just share my screen. I just have really just, I think, 2 slides of closure. Make sure this works. Is not sharing. Doesn't seem to be working. I don't know if I've been allowed. Am I allowed to share? Possibly. I think you're seeing now my slides. And I hope that's okay.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah,
Please
okay,
go.
thank you so much. So just to remind you, we've had some questions actually of issues maybe seeing on the website, because this is all very new and live, the release of the product. So if you do go to the homepage, you may not yet quite arrive to this product page, but as soon as we finish the webinar, that's what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that you can very easily navigate to this products page from the homepage of the GEM website. But you can already go directly to that link, and please do go there, start to review the products. As we say, this is a very new live launch, and there may be issues, there may be links not working, broken. There may be better ways that we can provide this information and access to you. So please do contact us if you have any issues, comments, or recommendations. And just really to wrap up, I'd just like to thank everyone that's contributed to producing these global seismic hazard and risk products. So we have the whole of the GEM Secretariat staff, but also the GEM Governing Board and our partners. So please do go to our website, to our team, to see all of our team here, who each and every one of the team has had some role in making sure that we were able to release all of these products today. And then I wanted to also just provide links to the Hazard Mosaic contributors and to the GEM Mosaic contributors. So on these web pages, you can go and see a full list of everyone that has had some role in providing input, feedback, models, data that has contributed to the development of these global seismic hazard and risk products. So with that, I would draw this webinar to a close. As I say, if you would like to have your question answered, just do hang around for a few more minutes, and we will be answering those questions by typing them into the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I thank you all for joining us. You will be able to access on the page of the event the slides, the video itself of this event, which has been live streamed on YouTube. So you will be able to access everything, but please, obviously, of course, just contact us if there's anything that you do not find afterwards. Thank you again.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you everybody for participating.
Fellow participants, are you there?